Father Antonio asked me to give this talk, he said these would not be academic talks. So I just want to make sure you knew that was a non-academic talk by Father Antonio. Beautiful. Beautiful and hard to follow, but also a very fitting, I think, preparation for what I'd like to talk about, which is the integral human formation of the priest, and specifically how St. John Paul II contributed to that thinking. Shortly after he was elected, well, a few years after he was elected in 1982, he visited Spain. It was actually the first time that a pope visited Spain, believe it or not. And he spoke to seminarians in Valencia. And he famously gave them one of the most concise summaries of priestly formation and the priestly vocation. He said this. He said, his, name meaning God, his calling is a declaration of love. Your response is commitment, friendship, and love manifested in the gift of your own life. You get the impression that he wasn't just speaking to those seminarians. He was speaking about his own life and his own journey. That program, hearing God's call as a declaration of love for him, and his own response in commitment and friendship and love. That's what he had been doing. That's what he was doing with his life. That's what he did until the very end. His priesthood was never an abstraction for him. It was never a theory. It was always deeply grounded in his own humanity. Karol Wojtyła, as many or all of you know, grew up in a very beautiful, nurturing family with the example of a devoted father in a cultured and very Catholic Poland. He endured grief and suffering at a very early age, beginning with the untimely death of his mother and his brother. He was trained in the rich heritage of his Polish culture as an artist, as a dramatist, as a poet. He suffered and resisted under the tyrannies of both Hitler and Stalin. And he loved nature. He loved mountains. He loved climbing. He loved hiking and skiing and canoeing. He had many deep, lifelong, abiding friendships with both men and women. All of this was part of his early human formation. And all of it contributed to a very textured humanity that became more and more attractive with age. Even as Pope, he was a great figure. He was an intellectual. He was a mystic. He was even a statesman. But under it all, we never lost sight of his humanity. And that in itself was a great lesson. We always knew there was a man underneath that white cassock. He brought all of that humanity with him to the priesthood and to the papacy, and he brought it with him as to bear upon his own understanding of human formation of priests. There are many, many things that I could draw from his what he contributed to the human formation of priests, but I'd like to point out three. But the point I first wished to make was just this one, that it wasn't simply a fruit of his intellectual and theological outlook. It was that. But they were also the fruit of his own personal human experience and life. His humanity was a decisive aspect of his priestly fruitfulness, and he wished to convey that same deep humanity to men as they were preparing for the priesthood. So the first contribution I'd like to point out is kind of the broadest, and it's about formation itself. The second is a little bit more anthropological, about his understanding of the human person. And then the third is something more directly about priestly ministry. And the first contribution is kind of the hardest to talk about because it's the one that is most obvious. And it's the fact that we engage in human formation itself. Believe it or not, that was a contribution of St. John Paul II. It's this idea of seeing something. He had this capacity, and he did this throughout his teachings, of seeing something that was always there, but he was able to see it as if for the first time. And he was able to cast it in a new light, in a way that was very compelling for modern men and women. Someone pointed out to me the other day that the Amazon logo has that arrow underneath it, and that arrow goes from A to Z, right? And so it's like they have everything at Amazon from A to Z. I mean, I'd seen that arrow however many millions of times, but then you sort of see it as if for the first time. he had that capacity to do this with, and he certainly did it in this area of human formation. In his landmark post-apostolic exhortation, Pastores Dabo Vobis, I will give you shepherds, in 1992, of course he recognized the unchanging nature of the priesthood itself, but he saw this new something. In the wide field of human formation, which is to say the human development of seminarians as mature human beings with an aim of preparing them to become better disciples of Christ, and if God calls them to the priesthood as well. And to be clear, I don't mean to say that there was no human formation before 1992. There certainly was. And we the example of many great saints and priest saints through all the centuries, and clearly with deep and effectively mature men in many cases, not in every case. But much of that human formation, most of that human formation, was presumed by the time you went to the seminary. It was in the families where that human formation took place and continues to take place. But the seminary formation was primarily focused on moral virtue, on theological training, on preparing to be a man of the church, to be a public figure. And so therefore the human formation, and the word itself didn't even exist before John Paul II. Human formation was something that was just kind of presumed and underneath. It wasn't consistent, it wasn't always deep, and particularly, I think, after the dramatic cultural changes of the 1960s and the sexual revolution and into the 70s and 80s, there was a profound need to take that portion of formation more seriously, to do it more systematically and more rigorously. And because that was not always done, we see many of the struggles that we have today and that we're experiencing in the church right now with staggering clarity and the need for deeper and better human formation, which was definitively one of the great contributions of St. John Paul II. In fact, it's really, in his view, kind of the basis of all priestly formation. Not the most important. That would be the spiritual formation of the man, preparing him to be in union with Christ and to be able to proclaim the gospel in all its fullness. But it's the foundation. I once heard the image of the cross. Apparently they don't have crucifixes here. I'm sure it's in our heart. So if you imagine the cross, you have the here's one right here. So if you imagine the cross, going up, right? That's kind of the spiritual formation, right? Reaching up to God. You have the intellectual formation, theology, philosophy, and all of that, which is like the bar, going across, kind of going through the mind. And then you have the corpus, which is the pastoral formation, right? When we take care of the people of God, we're taking care of Christ. And so where does that leave human formation? Human formation is the grounding, right? It's planted in the ground. You don't really see it, but without it, the whole thing comes apart. And that kind of, I think, is how John Paul II would have understood human formation. He speaks about the reason for it in Pastores Dabo Vobis, and he says a couple of different things. He says, first of all, good human formation will facilitate the reception of the gospel message by those that the priest encounters and preaches to and so forth. He says this: so we see that the human formation of the priest shows its special importance when related to the receivers of the mission. In order that his ministry may be humanly as credible and acceptable as possible, it is important that the priest should mold his human personality in such a way that it becomes a bridge and not an obstacle for others in their meeting with Jesus Christ, the Redeemer of humanity. To be a bridge and not an obstacle. It's kind of a negative reason, I suppose. There are also, I'm going to get to what he understands to be the positive reasons for human formation, but negatively, it's very important that a priest's personality not be an obstacle. And it might be that one or two of you have met a priest whose personality was a little bit of an obstacle rather than a bridge to Christ and to the gospel. But not just negatively, also no one here, I'm sure, but also positively. What does it do when you have a good human formation? He says there are a number of things that get. He says, first of all, by being well-formed humanly, a man understands himself and his own heart, and therefore is better able to understand others. He says, he should be able to know the depths of the human heart, to perceive difficulties and problems, to make meeting and dialogue easy, to create trust and cooperation, to express serene and objective judgments. And then he continues and he says it's not just that he knows his own heart and therefore knows the human condition, but he's also able to relate to others effectively when he's well-formed humanly. He continues, of special importance is the capacity to relate to others. This is truly fundamental for a person who is called to be responsible for a community and to be a man of communion. This demands that the priest not be arrogant or quarrelsome, but affable, hospitable, sincere in his words and heart, prudent and discreet, generous and ready to serve, capable of opening himself to clear and brotherly relationships, and of encouraging the same in others, and quick to understand, forgive, and console. And then lastly, the human formation he saw as, so not just understanding his own heart, not just relating to others, but also being attractive to others. His own human personality to be attractive, to draw people closer, not to himself, but to Christ. He says priests should be balanced people, strong and free, capable of bearing the weight of pastoral responsibilities. They need to be educated to love the truth, to be loyal, to respect every person, to have a sense of justice, to be true to their word, to be genuinely compassionate, to be men of integrity, and especially to be balanced in judgment and behavior. Shortly after he was elected pope, he went to see the seminarians of his new diocese, the seminarians of Rome, and he said this to them. He said, "The world looks to the priest because it looks to Jesus. No one can see Christ, but everyone sees the priest. And through him they wish to catch a glimpse of the Lord. Immense is the grandeur of the Lord. Immense is the grandeur and dignity of the priest." So given this importance that he gave to human formation and the many cultural changes, we can no longer ignore this important aspect of priestly seminary life. And John Paul II has given us the tools to help us in formation form this in the hearts of our seminarians. So after John Paul II, the focus on human formation is no longer an afterthought. It takes a place of prominence right alongside the other aspects of formation, even, in fact, as their foundation. The second contribution of John Paul II is what Father Antonio sort of already alluded to and developed somewhat, so I'll go through this rather quickly, but it's a very positive understanding of chaste celibacy. He's famous, of course, for the theology of the body, and that bracing and very positive affirmation and vision of sexuality, chastity, which is ordered not to not sinning, but actually to loving, to channeling and purifying our capacity for love and human fulfillment. And so this aspect of human formation, which is the broad aspect of preparing a man to be to live chaste celibacy, is a crucial dimension, and I think something that he really contributed to in a very decisive way, how we do this. He began his pontificate with his first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, and he said this in it. He said, "Man cannot live without love. He remains a being that is incomprehensible for himself. His life is meaningless if love is not revealed to him, if he does not encounter love, if he does not experience it and make it his own, if he does not participate intimately in it." Strong words. His life is meaningless, he says, if he doesn't encounter love. And that is not all human beings except priests, right? That's all human beings. And this teaching is certainly no less true for men and women called to celibacy. In his in Pastoris Dalba Vobis, he said, "We are speaking of a love that involves the entire person in all his or her aspects, physical, psychic, and spiritual, and which is expressed in the nuptial meaning of the human body, thanks to which a person gives oneself to another and takes the other to himself." This is in a document about formation for priests, which a person gives to another and takes the other to oneself. A properly understood sexual education leads to understanding and realizing this truth about human love. And this is the formation in self-mastery to which every Christian is called, and which St. John Paul II cast in a remarkably positive and attractive light. As was mentioned at the beginning, my doctoral dissertation was on supernatural fatherhood and how celibacy is ordered to that. And so, like, a key sort of assumption that I make is that a man who is in the seminary should be attracted to marriage, should be attracted to having a family. If you If you don't have the virtues to be a natural father, you're not going to have the virtues to be a supernatural father. But I think sometimes there is still this idea out there that in order to be formed for the priesthood, in order to become a priest, there shouldn't be that desire for marriage, you know? And so when I was serving as vocation director, which I did for 5 years, occasionally we'd get a guy who'd come in, you know, and of course we'd go through all the questions and stuff like that, and I'd be like, so, you know, are you attracted to marriage? You know, and he goes, oh, no. There is no desire whatsoever for me. I'm like, dude, you should have Googled me before coming into this thing, because that is the one thing you didn't want to say right there. Yeah, but so that desire needs to be there. And you know, and that means that there needs to be a formation in freedom, right? That's what John Paul II saw was the fundamental quality of preparing a man or a woman to have this self-mastery of chastity. This capacity to give ourselves to another requires freedom. We have to be free to do so. And this means a real comfort with oneself, with one's own body, with one's own sexuality, with one's own masculinity, one's own generative power. As I was just saying, we have to have that desire to be generative. Every man has that. Every functioning man has that desire to generate. And it has to, and every woman does too. And that has to be exercised and realized in whatever the vocation is to which we're called. I think the scandals that we're coping with right now are, they don't just originate in the breaking of the promise of celibacy. I think they go deeper than that. They reveal an unhealthy approach to sexuality itself. And this stems, I think, in large part to a tragic lack of formation and a real naivete about the conditions and the qualities that are needed for men entering the seminary and the priesthood. St. John Paul II saw that, and he set in motion a sequence of events that has led to far more integrated and, I think, wholesome sexual formation and human formation in general in the seminaries. You know, and once those building blocks are in place to really live this self-mastery, to live chastity well, then I think, and really only then, is a man free to discern celibacy. Right? We don't discern celibacy apart from this self-mastery of chastity. And so as a result, you know, I think when celibacy is lived in a way that's wholesome and effective and sort of spiritually mature, then a man is able to perceive it as something that is not an untethered gift, right? It's not an unmoored sacrifice, right? The sacrifice of celibacy is something that's ordered to the fulfillment of the nuptial meaning of the body, to that spousality to which every man and woman is called, and to spiritual fatherhood. And I really do believe that what we're seeing in this crisis today is not primarily a crisis of priesthood, but a crisis of fatherhood, right? These men, I mean, if there's any, even bad fathers, you know, don't abuse their children, frankly, you know, and they don't tolerate anyone who might, right? And so we see on so many levels, not just a kind of a failure to sort of form, you know, whatever the kind of the virtues needed to live chastity, but that deeper understanding of what's it all about and what's it directed to. And it's directed to, and I think he explains it in a very compelling way, it's directed to true generation in the supernatural order, in the order of grace. And so as a result, his own teaching, but especially his life, he showed us how to do that, John Paul II. And he continues to influence generations of seminarians and priests who, like him, wish to live well the beautiful and life-giving chaste celibacy to which they're called. The third contribution that I'd like to point out to integral human formation made by St. John Paul II is, as I said, the first one was kind of more about formation. The second was sort of anthropological. This third one is about the priesthood itself. In a way, this is kind of the necessary fruit of human formation. And that is an emphasis on the priesthood as a gift of self, as a vocation of service, a vocation of love, a vocation that's lived in a deeply human way, becoming a man for others. You know, when people meet a priest, it should be very clear to them that they're meeting a man who is on a mission, right? That he belongs to others, that he's not caught up in himself. And the novelty of this contribution, of this emphasis, let's say, of John Paul II, is not in the idea itself, obviously, right? The priesthood was always supposed to be a life of service and generosity, and many great priest saints, known and unknown, lived it that way. But it was sometimes obscured, and it still sometimes is obscured, by an implicit, sometimes an explicit, clerical mindset that hindered the healthy development of seminarians. The novelty of John Paul II was in the emphasis, in regrounding the priesthood in its real, true source and motive, and giving an example of that in his own life. John Paul II said that one can only truly give oneself if one is free to do so. So fostering human freedom is one of the most important goals of seminary formation. He says this in Pastoris Dabo Vobis. Human maturity, and in particular effective maturity, requires a clear and strong training in freedom, which expresses itself in convincing and heartfelt obedience to the truth of one's own being, to the meaning of one's own existence, that is, to the sincere gift of self, as the way and fundamental content of the authentic realization of self. Thus understood, freedom requires the person to be truly master of oneself, determined to fight and overcome the different forms of selfishness and individualism which threaten the life of each one, ready to open out to others, generous in dedication and service to one's neighbor. This is important for the response that will have to be given to the vocation, and in particular to the priestly vocation, and for the faithfulness to it and the commitments connected with it. A man who is able to give himself to others, who is free to give himself to others in love, is a man with a well-integrated, effective life, a man able to focus on others, to listen, to empathize, a man free of unhealthy dependencies and emotional neediness. Every mother and father knows this and knows what this is like, right? This idea of just giving yourself, and you give and give and give with very little, sometimes, affirmation and response. And yet in that gift, we truly find who we are. And we, you know, after all of the sleepless nights and the loss of whatever it is, you know, for when a man becomes a father or a woman becomes a mother, you know, I mean, you look back on it and they wouldn't trade it for the world. You know, I mean, sometimes they might trade it for the world, but I mean, usually it's something that they recognize as the greatest gift that they've ever received. Is this opportunity, this paradigm in which they can give of themselves until it hurts. And that's what a priest has to experience as well. To love everyone with a fatherly heart, being interested in all souls, in the salvation of souls, treating everyone with the same respect, regardless of age or wealth or position or good looks, and though maybe with a father's special love for the weak, for the sick, for the suffering, for the children, for the sinful. Everyone has a right to expect us to be there for them because of who we are. Everyone has a claim on a Catholic priest. You know, when I grew up, as was mentioned, I grew up in the Protestant church, and I had wonderful, wonderful examples of pastors growing up. They were all married, and we didn't think anything of it. But what I realized looking back on it is that everyone knew, including them, including me, everyone knew that we came second, right? His family came first, obviously. That's the way it's supposed to be, right? And that sense has been, that's been inverted in the celibate priesthood, right? Where you come first. And to recognize that and to be able to do that requires that training in freedom, which I think is an important and very important contribution that John Paul II made to the human formation of priests. I don't really have time to get into a lot of the details there, but I'll just maybe mention a few things that I think can be drawn out of his writings as ways of growing in this freedom. One of them is simply humility, right, which clears the way, which clears obstacles from the path of the gift of self. You know, forgetting that our first and really only claim to greatness is the same that you have, which is union with Christ through baptism, right? That it is that clericalism is really the inverting of that, right? It's placing ordination before baptism. It's forgetting that we are first disciples and then priests. And when we remember that, when we are regrounded in that discipleship, then I think we have the capacity to really become truly generous and freely giving priests. And humility is in all the different ways that we can imagine humility. It's just kind of a lack of focus on self. There can be so much attention on oneself in a public position like the priesthood, and sort of consciously living out a modesty in conversation and in demeanor. Naturalness, I think, is an important part of this growth and freedom. Being comfortable in our own skin, not being affected, not being awkward, you know, making the gift of self unassuming and pleasant. most men have a means for not becoming weird. It's called his wife, right? Doesn't always work, but usually it does. And a celibate priest doesn't have that, right? And so that's why we are the way we are. No, that's why we have to be very conscious in our formation in naturalness, right? That sense of not drawing attention to ourselves with ostentatious idiosyncrasies and eccentricities. And naturalness is a close relative of humility, because it means, really what it means is that we're trying to get out of the way, so that Christ can be seen and not us. There was a moment I think it might have been in 2005, Good Friday, right before he died, that John Paul II was filmed. There's a famous image of him holding on, it's from this back though, and he wasn't able to go to the Way of the Cross that year at the Colosseum. So I think that's actually the year that Cardinal Ratzinger did it. Beautiful reflections on the Stations of the Cross. Anyway, there's a picture of John Paul II watching it on television with the cross, and he's holding onto the cross, and the picture's from behind. And the networks showed this picture, and I remember George Weigel, the biographer of John Paul II, responding to some of the reports, saying that the networks were saying that he's in such bad shape, that that his face really looked that bad. Is that why you don't have the picture? And it's from the front. And Weigel's, I think, response was perfect. He says, no. He says, that's what he's been doing his entire priesthood. That's what he's been doing his entire pontificate. It was never about him to begin with, right? It was always about leading people to Christ. And until you understand that, you don't understand him, right? And so that kind of getting out of the way and allowing sort of in humility and naturalness the personality of Jesus to come to the fore through the human personality of the priest. Another area maybe of kind of this way of growing in self-gift is these are all kind of simple virtues, and that's kind of the point, is that he was able to kind of drill down into some very simple things. Another one is simply courtesy, being a man of kindness, showing concern, being able to listen. St. Francis of Assisi said that courtesy is one of the qualities of God. And this is, in hospitality and showing respect, from the person who cleans the bathroom to the Pope, just like that sense of real love for the human reality. Showing time and attention, what Adrian von Speyer said is, love is time and attention. Showing time and giving time and showing attention to people. Really paying attention to people around us. Learning how to forgive from the heart. The age of sort of the cynical, jaded, grumpy priest is over, if it was ever here. That sense of just being really kind of a gentleman, and not being a gossip, and all of that stuff that goes into being a real man, a courteous man, a man for others. We come from smaller families typically today, and so we're all a little bit more spoiled. We're all a little bit more demanding. And this makes generosity, the gift of self, a little bit more difficult for most of us. And there's a strong tendency towards narcissism and kind of the self-absorption today. And seminarians and priests are not immune, from breathing that same atmosphere. And so inspiring in seminarians, inspiring in priests, this desire to pour themselves out, to give until it hurts. Mother Teresa's famous line, I have found the paradox that if you love until it hurts, there can be no more hurt, only more love. Right? And that giving and sort of helping men to see that paradox and the call that Jesus has for each of them to truly become men for others. There really isn't a lot of space for mediocrity today, and that priests have to be inspired and so that the fire is lit in their hearts and in their priesthood. Certainly John Paul II showed this very beautifully with his own life in this gift of self. And he did to the very last drop of his blood. I was in the square in 2005 when he died, and he came out that Sunday, Easter Sunday. You may recall it was just a few days before he died, and he gave a blessing. He was supposed to give the Urbi et Orbi address, and he just couldn't. Like he had the text in front of him. He opened his mouth, and nothing would come out. It was painful to see, but also so beautiful to see. Like this man had given all that he had. He had nothing left. And he couldn't, and you could tell he was kind of frustrated. He wanted to be able to speak one last time. And so all he did is he just kept giving the sign of the cross over and over and over again. And that's it. That's all he had. And that was the last public, that last time we saw him in public. Maybe the greatest evidence that John Paul II possessed this deep capacity to give himself was the fact that he was venerated by people who are able to detect inauthenticity and hypocrisy almost with infallibility, and that is young people. They loved him, even until the very end. You know, old folks would say, like, why do all these young people go after this guy? He's this old, sick man, you know, who has never had a social media account and, you know, supposedly doesn't really understand kind of the modern world. And yet the answer was simple, because he set their sights on something higher than what the world was selling them. He said at World Youth Day in 2002, "Dear young people, do not be content with anything less than the highest ideals. Do not let yourselves be dispirited by those who are disillusioned with life and have grown deaf to the deepest and most authentic desires of their hearts. You are right to be disappointed with hollow entertainment and passing fads, and with aiming at too little in life." You know, the world told them that mediocrity was enough, that they just needed to get by, that no one could expect too much of them, that morality and holiness were beyond their reach. And he thundered over and over again that that was a lie. He set their hearts ablaze with the possibility of giving themselves generously, extravagantly. He inspired countless young men and women to magnanimity, greatness of heart, largeness of soul, conversions to Christ, vocations to the priesthood and religious life, generosity with large families, total and radical and unflinching commitment to all of the teachings of the church. Young people are hardwired to give it all, and it takes a lot of work to crush the noble idealism of youth. And John Paul II was able to cut through all of that craftiness of the evil one by the force of his interior life, to be sure, but also by the attractiveness, the persuasiveness of his own humanity. These are difficult times to be a priest, to be sure. And in one sense, it's also kind of a wonderful time to be a priest. There was, I think, my favorite quote from John Paul II. He said in France, and he said, "Just when night engulfs us, we must think about dawn coming. We must believe that every morning the church is revived through her saints." It's a beautiful thought. Every morning the church is revived in her saints. And I think that he was saying literally, like every morning, you know, the church gets up, and it's the saints who move the life of the church forward. But I think he was also speaking sort of allegorically, you know, that we are kind of in a darkness right now. There are dark times here. We must think, as he says, about dawn coming, and it will be through saints that the dawn rises. Despite what some may think, this is actually a great time to be a seminarian. Some even identify this as the golden age of seminary formation because of the example and because of the teachings of St. John Paul II and what seminarians have access to. The seminary is to be a time of fidelity, a time of rigor and seriousness, a time of joy. And joy, of course, is the fruit of an interior life well lived, a life of holiness, a life of charity. And St. John Paul II certainly reflected that joy, as do many who are in the seminaries now and preparing for the priesthood. And I think in large part because his emphasis in his life and in his teaching on the integral human dimension of human formation is taken so seriously today in seminary formation. And that yields and will continue to yield great fruit in chaste celibacy, which will blossom in lives of self-giving priestly love for the profound and enduring good of the church and of the entire world. Thank you.